we're live.
Action.
Okay, so my population of concern was chronic anxiety and depression. So kind of a description of that. Just many studies have shown that mental health disorders contribute to burdens of other diseases. A lot of times people don't get help for mental health disorders because they don't feel as though it is a real illness. And so they just let it build up and don't really get the help that they need. Depression and anxiety are also frequently associated with worsening outcomes of other diseases, such as diabetes, asthma, arthritis, and heart conditions. Mental health disorders are also lifelong and chronic, and they can reoccur throughout the individual's lifespan. Sometimes it can stem from some trauma from childhood, or it might just be a genetic factor that you are predispositioned to. But they're becoming way more prevalent in today's day and age, and it's becoming a lot more of a normal thing for people with mental health disorders to realize that just because it's only a mental thing doesn't mean that they don't need treatment and that it's not any less of a disease. So the size of this population, so I started out with local. I live in Ogden. The percentages that I found, Ogden is actually one of the higher percentage places in Utah for depression and chronic anxiety. They have a 28.1% prevalence. Utah in general also has a higher rate when related to the U.S. The U.S. Averages about 40 million adults in the U.S. aged 18 and up, or an 18.1% of the population each year with anxiety disorders, and Utah is around 24%. So if you're just looking at Utah's population, it's actually a lot higher. And then I thought this was also super interesting. Only 36.9% of those suffering seek treatment options and actually deal with their mental health disorders. Depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. 1 in 13 people worldwide suffer from anxiety. So it's really a huge thing that a lot of people don't realize that it is a real illness. And I think that's just a huge issue, especially in today's day and age with COVID and people being quarantined and alone and everything like that. Rates are definitely increasing with depression, and especially suicide rates. So I think just coming up with some sort of plan to help this population so that they feel like they are being taken care of and they feel that their illness really is something to be helped. Okay, so some of the social determinants of health with chronic anxiety and depression. So there's a lot of social determinants. There's a significant impact on the health of girls and women. Females have a lot higher of a risk factor for depression. A lot of that can stem from gender injustice and social exclusion. A lot of times women aren't seen as equals, and that can really play a factor into that. A lot of times as well, the social norms and attitudes of people with depression is a lot different. They get looked at differently because they have a mental illness that they either haven't dealt with or that people just don't understand them. And so people with depression and anxiety can have a lot of insecurities, hopelessness, rapid social change. They are frequently trying out new friend groups, trying to honestly cling on to anything that can help them. And it just doesn't ever cling or work for them, so they're rapidly just changing their social statuses, and they also have a risk of violence. A lot of studies have actually showed a link between poverty and depression and anxiety. So the economic stability is really a factor of health. Poor mental health worsens the economic situation, and it just becomes a vicious cycle that your mental health worsens because your economic situation is lessened, and then it just keeps going worse and worse and worse and kind of digs itself into its own little hole. Also, there's been a high prevalence of mental disorders with low education. A lot of times people with these mental disorders, depression, they don't feel as though they want to put in the effort. They don't want to really try with anything. They are really down on themselves. They don't see themselves as someone that can succeed, and so they just don't These specific concerns are a little bit the same as the slide before, so just kind of reiterating psychosocial, economic, education, and then culture and genetics. Genetics definitely plays a huge part in anxiety and depression. People are predispositioned to mental health illnesses, and it's kind of their lifestyle that they choose and the culture that they're brought up in that determines how bad or how well that they handle these mental disorders. So the root causes for this population of health, I asked myself, why is this population vulnerable? My biggest root cause that I found for depression and chronic anxiety stems from genetic dispositioning, as I mentioned before. And then again, the social and cultural upbringing can also gauge how severe or well handled the mental issues are. Another problem that I found pretty interesting was social seclusion. This can stem from a lack of compliance to doctor's appointments, so they don't think that they need help, or they either take too little or too much of their medication because they don't think it's working, or they just aren't really taking care of themselves in the way that they should. I looked up a lot of different journal articles and blog posts from people with depression and anxiety, and a lot of those kind of said that once they realized how poor their self-care was when they were able to kind of tackle their mental illness and get a handle on it, whether that be with exercise, eating healthy, sleeping right, all of that kind of stuff. And then just admitting to yourself that you do have something wrong and that's totally okay, and that you have plenty of treatment options. Okay, so with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the MET tiers were the bottom two, physiological and safety. I felt like these ones were pretty well. Most people, unless they were super low functioning with depression, that would have led more into suicidal people and major depressive disorders. But for the most part, all of the needs on the physiological and safety tiers were met. The unmet ones would be self-actualization, esteem, and love and belonging. A lot of people with anxiety, I can speak from myself in particular, can kind of feel like they don't belong anywhere, or that people are always looking down on them, or they just don't feel accepted. That definitely takes a huge toll on people's self-esteem and how they see themselves. And so if they're thinking that other people aren't seeing them the way that they want to be seen, then they also don't see themselves that way. And so a lot of times, these three tiers especially, they just have a really hard time with functioning in that sense of feeling like they belong somewhere and feeling like they know what they're doing. A person with chronic anxiety and depression can function well physiologically, but will often have issues with self-esteem, confidence, a sense of achievement, spontaneity, and can have a hard time keeping relationships with others because of the internal battles. The anticipated functional level that I said would be quite low, just because if they are not taking care of themselves and not focusing on these things, then they're not going to be well functioning. The likely health outcomes that I found with chronic anxiety and depression is if the individual is not coping with their disease and not properly caring for themselves, the health outcomes would be poor. If they can accept the mental illness and the treatment regimen, they can have a more positive health outcome. Okay, so with communicable and non-communicable diseases, I started off with communicable. With mental health disorders, they're not really more predisposed to acquiring diseases, but however, if they first just say they are not taking care of themselves, they're not high functioning, they have a sedentary lifestyle, they might be at a higher risk for infection just based off of the way that they care for themselves. Depression and chronic anxiety also cannot necessarily cause non-communicable diseases, but there were a lot of studies that I found that proved to show worsening of diseases such as heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and arthritis. The disease process just kind of takes more of a toll on them mentally and then can create more problems, and it kind of just becomes, again, that vicious cycle where they just can't really get out. I think it is big too, if they aren't taking care of themselves, then they are more predisposed for the non-communicable diseases. So it technically can be a cause of that, but most of the studies that I found were more when they have other diseases and anxiety, they're just constantly thinking of everything bad that's happening to them. Everything kind of is just ganging up on each other, and these disease processes definitely worsen and go a little bit quicker. A specific concern for this population would be self-care and self-harm. I have definitely talked a lot about that. There is a high Calvin. There is a high chance for alcohol and drug abuse, especially like I talked about before, if they have a medication regimen that they are prescribed by their doctor. A lot of times people don't follow that closely because they don't feel like it's doing anything, or they might double up on days that they feel more sad or feel more anxiety. So that can be a cause of drug abuse, or they think a lot of things are in their head, and so they will take more pain meds and they might get involved in more hardcore drugs. There was also a lot of articles talking about poor eating habits that can lead to other mental illnesses since they already are predisposed to mental illnesses such as anorexia or bulimia. A lot of this is just self-care, poor sleep and exercise habits. When things get really bad, suicidal ideations come into play. They can stem from poor self-esteem or the just impending sadness of depression, especially if any big events happen, traumas, even things just like death in the family, breakups, divorce, anything like that. That can add to that sadness, and then it can kind of just be a spiral from there. One thing, like I've said, lifestyle has every ability to control and regulate someone with these disorders. It just depends on how they choose to view themselves and how they choose to reach out for help. Risk for harm by and to others. Chronic anxiety and depression comes with the poor self-esteem and low quality of life if the individual cannot cope with the disease process. It is very vital that they are surrounding themselves with people who are accepting of them and that can vouch for them when they are having a hard time or kind of spiraling out of control. It's really important to these individuals what other people think of them, and it can really impact their self-esteem. Depression and anxiety can also rub off onto others when this population is constantly down and unhappy and relying on others. It's kind of the same thing as caregiver strain with the elderly or with anything like that. And it can also take a really big toll on family, just depending on how severe it is. It is important, like I said, for people with these mental illnesses to surround themselves with people that they can just be themselves and that promote their well-being the best that they know how. And there's my references, and that is all. I probably missed a lot, but did my best. Thank you. Good night, everybody.